There's something about leaving a house with only the clothes on your back. You don't take anything, not because you're in a hurry, not because you planned it that way. You don't take anything because taking something means you can see past the end of the driveway, and in that moment, you cannot. The night is in front of you, and that is the full extent of your world. I left a house on Wendell Avenue at 19 with 2 bags of clothes and nothing else. The house had a kitchen where I had eaten breakfast every day of my life. It had a step on the staircase, third from the bottom, that had been loose since I was 7 years old and made a specific sound in the dark. It had a window above the sink that faced east and caught the October light at 7 in the morning in a way I have never been able to describe properly. I left all of it. I drove to the end of the block. I did not look back. 30 years later, I came back. And the people who had sent me away did not know it was me. My name is Claire Morrow. This is the story I have never told anyone completely. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a bit. Tonight we're spending time with Claire, 49, a real estate investor in Columbus, Ohio, a woman who built an entire life on her own after being sent out the door at 19 with 2 bags and a silence that lasted decades. What she came back for wasn't what most people would expect, and what she found waiting for her wasn't what she'd imagined either. We're here every day. Before we start, subscribe. It helps us grow the channel. Let's go. The morning of the closing, I sat in my car on Wendell Avenue for 4 minutes before I went in. Not because I was nervous. I have sat across from a great many tables in my career, and I am not often nervous before a table. I sat in the car because I wanted to see it again before it became officially mine, in the particular way of things that change their meaning the moment they're signed over. I wanted one more look at it as the thing it had been. The house at 22 Wendell was quieter than I remembered it. The neighborhood had the texture of a weekday morning in December. A few cars, a dog being walked on the opposite side of the street, bare trees. The sky was the committed gray that Ohio manages from November through March, as if clouds are the default and blue is the exception someone forgot to enforce. I looked at the house from the car. The shutters were white now. She changed them at some point in the last decade, and I hadn't known. In my memory, the shutters had always been yellow. Sandra repainted them every few years, a deliberate yellow that communicated something she cared about communicating. The white was wrong to me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Some small continuity I'd been holding in my mental picture of this house was simply gone, replaced by this ordinary, unremarkable white, and I sat with the absence of the yellow for a moment before I got out of the car. The crack in the driveway was new, or newer anyway, running from the base of the front steps down toward the street at a diagonal, the kind of crack that takes years to appear and then years more to reach its full length. Patient, geological. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house for the last few seconds in which it was not mine. Then I went to sign the papers. The house at 22 Wendell Avenue had yellow shutters in 1975, which was the year I was born, and yellow shutters in 1986, which was the year I left. My mother, Sandra, repainted them every few years because she believed that what your neighbors saw before they knocked was a statement of character, not about money. She was careful about never appearing to care about money, but about the quality of attention you brought to the things in your care. A house with peeling paint was a house where people had stopped paying attention, and in Sandra's world, stopping paying attention was a form of moral failure. The yellow shutters were correct. The garden was correct. The particular grade of clean she maintained inside the house was correct. I grew up inside these correctnesses, and I did not question them, because they were the texture of home, and home was all I knew. My father, Gary, was different from her in the way that made them work for 43 years. He was a gentleman, not prone to strong opinions, good with his hands in the manner of men who grew up before that became a personality type. He fixed what broke. He repainted what Sandra indicated. He sat at the head of the table at Sunday dinners and said grace without hurrying it. In 23 years of childhood, I never once heard him raise his voice to her. I used to think that was love. I think it was something more complicated than love. But this is not his story, and I have made what peace with him I'm able to make. I was their only child. For most of my childhood, 22 Wendell was a good house to grow up in. Not perfect. No house is perfect from the inside, but genuinely good. Sandra made Sunday dinners that required the entirety of Sunday. Stock from scratch, bread she'd started the night before, desserts she had opinions about. Gary took me to the library every Saturday morning and let me choose whatever I wanted, without consulting any list he might have had. We had a dog named Cheddar for 11 years, who slept at the foot of my bed and smelled like warm dirt and old couch. When he died in the spring of 1983, I was 8. My father cried in the garage with the door half closed, and I stood in the yard for a while and didn't go in, because I understood, even then, that some grief needs a small amount of privacy. We were not a family that spoke directly about what mattered, but we were, for a long time, a family that loved each other in the wordless way of families who believe that showing up is the same as saying so. The fracture was slow. I can locate it now, looking back, to a specific Wednesday in 9th grade, when my English teacher, Mrs. Holbrook, suggested I apply for a summer program in Columbus that involved business writing and market analysis. I came home excited and told Sandra at dinner, and she said without looking up from her plate, "That's not really what we had in mind for your summers." I said, "What did you have in mind?" She said, "Something more balanced." I thought about the word balanced for a week. I couldn't figure out what it meant in the context of my life at 14. Balanced against what? Against what other weight? By 16, I had a habit of reading the real estate listings in the Sunday paper. Not because anyone suggested it, because something in the logic of property made sense to me in a way that most things didn't. Here is a thing that exists. Here is what it is worth. Here is why. Here is how the value moves. I started noticing things on walks. Which streets had renovation activity? Which blocks were changing? What distinguished a house that was becoming from one that had stopped? I had no language for it yet, just instinct. But the instinct was there, and it was specific. By 17, I had a part-time job at a property management company on the east side that I had found myself and not mentioned to Sandra. I filed documents, answered phones, watched the office manager, a woman named Pearl, who had been running that office for 22 years, move through her days with the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was worth and had decided to act accordingly. I wanted to be like Pearl. Sandra found out about the job from Mrs. Delacroix, who had seen me leave the house on a Tuesday afternoon in my work clothes. She didn't say anything directly to me for a week. Then she said at dinner that she wished I had talked to her first. I said I hadn't thought there was anything to talk about. She said, "There's always something to talk about when it involves your future." I said, "I'll keep the job." She said, "I know you will." We did not speak about it again for months. But after that, something had changed in the house, a degree of pressure that hadn't been there before, subtle enough to ignore on individual days, impossible to ignore over weeks. By 18, I had attended a weekend real estate investing seminar with Aunt Barbara, who was my father's older sister and the only adult in my vicinity at that time who seemed genuinely interested in me as I actually was, rather than as a project requiring correction. Barbara had built her own stability through a combination of good instincts and a refusal to be talked out of things, and she recognized something in me and decided to encourage it rather than redirect it. She drove me home from that seminar and said, somewhere on the highway, "Your mother loves you. She just loves a version of you that isn't quite you." I was 18. I thought that was a distinction I could work with. By 19, I was working 2 jobs and studying property listings the way other people my age were reading novels. I knew which neighborhoods in Columbus were on their way up. I had a list of properties I was tracking, watching for price movements. I had a plan that did not involve a 4-year university or a career my mother could summarize at dinner parties. I had a direction, which was not the direction Sandra had decided on. The arguments started in earnest when I was 18 and did not stop. Not every week, not dramatically, but regularly enough to develop a rhythm. Sandra and I would collide, not because either of us was careless, but because we were both committed to our own versions of what was true, and the versions did not fit in the same room. She said things that were accurate and landed wrong. I said things that were accurate and landed wrong. Gary sat in the living room with the television at a volume adjusted specifically to cover the sound. I have spent years being angry at him for those adjusted volumes. I am now in a different place with it, but the anger was real, and I won't pretend it wasn't. The night I left, I was 19 years, 4 months, and 12 days old. I know the count because I had a habit of marking things on my calendar. Not dramatically, just noting. And when I packed that night, I looked at the date and I counted. It felt important to know the exact number. I don't know why, it still does. The argument began over a phone call. I had been corresponding with a property management firm in Columbus that was considering me for a junior position. Real work, real responsibility, the thing I'd been building toward. I called my contact that afternoon from the kitchen phone, not thinking Sandra was home, not thinking about anything except the call. She had picked up the extension in her room. That evening, she came to my doorway and stood there in the measured way she used when she was most upset. And she said, "I cannot continue to support a life that is going nowhere." I said, "It's not going nowhere. It's going somewhere you haven't decided to look." She said, "I am your mother, and I am telling you that this path will not give you what you think it will." I said, "You don't know what I think it will give me." A silence. Then, "If you're going to pursue this, you'll need to do it somewhere else. I won't watch you choose this and pretend it's fine. You need to leave." I waited. I waited for the sound of the television going off, for footsteps in the hall, for my father's voice saying something, anything, from the other room. I waited for an indication that he had heard what was happening and had a position on it. Just the program he was watching, low and steady, and my mother in my doorway, and the specific quality of air in a house when something that cannot be undone is about to happen. I said, "Okay." I packed 2 bags. Sandra stood in the hallway for part of it, watching without speaking, then went to the kitchen. I could hear the tap running. I don't know what she was doing in there. I finished packing. I walked to the front door and I walked out. She did not ask where I was going. She did not say goodbye. The door closed. The yellow shutters were the last thing I registered as I backed out of the driveway. I turned the corner at the end of Wendell Avenue, and I drove until the street was gone, and then I pulled over, and I sat there for a while in the dark, with nothing in my hands. I slept on Aunt Barbara's couch for 3 weeks. Her apartment was off Broad Street, in a building that smelled like other people's cooking, and had a laundry room in the basement with machines that took quarters. She made space without ceremony. She left a key on the kitchen counter and told me the couch folded out. She did not suggest I had probably done something wrong. She did not ask when I was planning to go back. She opened her door and she made room. And that act, so undramatic, so quiet, so absent of conditions, meant more to me at 19 than I knew how to say. She also loaned me $2,000 with no paperwork. I paid it back in 14 months. She said she'd known I would. The first year was the kind of hard that doesn't make good stories later. You survived it. You kept moving. The alternative was stopping, and stopping felt more dangerous than moving. By October, I had a room in a shared house with 2 other women. By November, I had a second job. By December, I had a system. I studied for my real estate exams in the parking lots of the buildings where I cleaned offices on Tuesday and Thursday nights, with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, and the specific concentration of someone who has recently been told they're wrong about themselves and is in the process of proving otherwise. I got my license on the third attempt. That is the accurate version, not the triumphant one, the accurate one. Sandra had told the neighbors that I'd chosen to leave. I found this out 6 months after the fact, from Barbara, who mentioned it the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. Sandra had told Mrs. Delacroix, who had known me since second grade, who had given me a card with a $5 bill on every birthday until I was 14, that Claire had wanted her independence, that she'd decided to go out on her own, that Sandra had done her best to support the decision. I sat in Barbara's kitchen when she told me this and looked at the window over the sink and thought about what to do with that information. What I felt was not pure anger, though there was anger in it. It was something more disorienting, the understanding that the story was already being written without me in the room, and the version being written was one in which I had simply chosen to leave, and Sandra had been gracious about it, and everything was comprehensible, and nobody had done anything that required examination. The reframing was complete. The story had been told, absorbed, and filed. She believes it, Barbara said carefully. Or she needs to. I'm not certain there's a difference. I called my father twice that first year. He answered both times in the low, careful voice he used when Sandra might be within earshot. He asked how I was. He said he was glad I was okay. He did not mention what had happened. He did not ask when I was coming home. Neither call lasted 10 minutes. I stopped calling. I want to be fair to him. Fairness is something I've been practicing for a long time, with uneven results. He was a man who had spent decades finding the path of least resistance in his marriage. And by the time I left, he had lost the ability to see any other path. He was not indifferent to me. I do not believe he was indifferent. But indifference and absence produce the same outcome in the end. And I was 20 years old and living in a room that faced a brick wall, and the outcome was all I had. By 24, I had partnered with a woman named Diane from my exam prep class, one of the few people in that room who was there for the same reasons I was, on 2 rental units near Ohio State that the neighborhood consensus said were in a declining corridor. We believed the corridor was turning. We were right. By the time Diane moved to Atlanta for her husband's job, and we dissolved the partnership, we had converted those 2 units into enough capital to give each of us a real foundation. Diane was the most practically intelligent person I have ever worked with. She had a way of reading a set of numbers and seeing through them to the behavior they were measuring, which is a rarer skill than people understand. We were not exactly friends. We were something more specific, the bond of 2 people who have been in a difficult situation together and emerged differently shaped but intact. When she left for Atlanta, we had dinner and said what needed to be said and wished each other well, and I meant every word of it. After Diane, I worked alone for 2 years. I found that I preferred it. I was 27 when I bought the property at 14 Wendell Avenue. I want to be precise about this part, because the way I've told it to myself has shifted over the years. What happened was, I was reviewing a list of available properties in Northeast Columbus, which I did every Monday, and 14 Wendell appeared in the list, and the numbers were sound, and the location fit the profile I was building. I put it on the drive-by list. I drove by on a Thursday in March. The day was brown and thin, Ohio early spring, before anything commits to growing. I parked in front of number 14 and was assessing the roofline and the condition of the porch. And then I looked up the street. Number 22, white trim now, yellow shutters still, a light on in the kitchen. I sat in the car. I was aware that I was sitting there longer than a drive-by evaluation required. I was aware of something moving through me that I did not name. Then I called my broker and told her I wanted to make an offer on 14. She asked what had caught my attention. I said, the numbers. I set up a management company to run the property. The sign went up that 14 Wendell, 3 weeks after closing. Sandra never knew it was me. The company name had nothing of mine she would have recognized. She could have walked past that sign every week, heard the neighbors mention it, and my name wouldn't have appeared anywhere in it. 8 houses down from the home she had raised me in, and then asked me to leave, and I was invisible. That was fine. I wasn't doing it for her to see. The years after that were productive. I expanded the portfolio. I hired 2 people, then 4. I took on commercial properties in my late 30s and found a different set of problems that required a different kind of thinking, which I found genuinely interesting. I sold 14 Wendell when the neighborhood metrics shifted and the returns no longer justified the position. I felt nothing particular about that. I turned 32 and went to my cousin Tyler's wedding in June. Sandra and Gary were also guests. It was the first time I had been in the same room as my mother in 13 years. I saw her from across the reception hall before she saw me. She was smaller than my memory of her, or maybe I was larger, some combination of both. Her hair was different. She moved through the room with the composed precision I had grown up watching. Each person she passed received the appropriate degree of warmth, calibrated to relationship and context, delivered with exactness. She was, in that way, unchanged. We said hello. We stood in the same region of the room for perhaps 5 minutes and exchanged sentences that communicated nothing except that we were both capable of existing in proximity without incident. Gary hugged me quickly, with his chin pressed into my shoulder, and said, "You look good, Claire," in the voice of a man who had a different sentence inside him and couldn't locate it. I sat at table 9. They were at table 2. I did not look in their direction more than twice. That was the last time I saw them for a long time. Years of nothing. The particular silence of people who have, without saying so, agreed to let the distance remain. I noted the distance, and I kept going. That Christmas, I drove down Wendell Avenue at 10 o'clock at night. I don't know what I intended. I told myself I was just in the area, which was not true. The area required a deliberate detour. I drove down the street slowly. The houses had their lights on, the particular warm interior glow of December evenings. Everyone inside with whatever version of family they had. The house at 22 Wendell had a light in the front window and one in what I thought might be the kitchen. I parked and sat there for 8 minutes. I was 34 years old, sitting in a car outside a house I had a key to in my glove compartment, and I thought very clearly, I have been waiting for something. Not waiting in the way I had told myself for years, not the distant, managed kind of waiting where you tell yourself you've moved on, but leave a small door open just in case. The waiting I had been doing was active and continuous. It had been operating underneath everything, underneath the work, the decisions, the years of building. Like a background process I'd never shut down. The belief, stubborn and apparently structural, that one day something would shift, that Sandra would acknowledge what happened, that Gary would say what he'd been not saying since 1986, that there would be some form of correction to the record, some acknowledgement that I hadn't simply chosen to leave. Sitting in that car on Wendell Avenue at 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, I understood that I had been waiting for a thing that was not going to happen. She was not going to call. He was not going to say the real sentence. The story she told Mrs. Delacroix was the only story she was capable of, and it was not going to change. And I had been spending a portion of my life, not consciously, but genuinely, measurably, waiting for it to. There's a particular grief in giving up hope for something you didn't know you were still hoping for. I sat in the car, and I let myself feel it. Not for the mother I had, for the version of her I had been waiting for. The one who would eventually see me clearly. The one who would eventually correct the record. The one who would call, just once, in any form, in any register, and say, actually, I was wrong. That version was not real. She had never been real. The real Sandra was a woman who would tell a neighbor that her daughter had chosen to leave and believe it completely. And that was not a detail to be overcome. That was the data. That was who she was. I drove home from Wendell Avenue. I made myself a drink. I sat in my living room in the particular silence of a decision that has finally been made. And I thought about what the next 30 years of my life were going to look like now that I had stopped asking this question. Then I went to bed. Then I kept going. The 15 years after that Christmas were different. Not dramatically different, not suddenly easier or suddenly better in ways I could point to, just different in texture, quieter in the specific places where something had been loud. I expanded into commercial properties and found I was good at them in a way that interested me more than residential ever had. The problems were larger and the solutions required different thinking, and the thinking suited me. I hired good people and kept the ones who were good and let the rest find their way elsewhere without drama. I had a relationship with a man named Paul that lasted 6 years. He was kind and patient and loved me in a thorough, unhurried way that I found genuinely comforting for a long time. When we ended it because we wanted different things in the second half of our lives, and we were both honest about it, and we separated with more care and less grief than I had expected. I think of him without complication. I turned 45 on a Tuesday in October. I took myself to a restaurant I liked on the north side of downtown and ordered the salmon and a glass of white wine and read 60 pages of a novel I later abandoned and walked home through the cold air and felt mostly okay. 3 people from my office sent flowers to my house. Barbara called, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and that was the birthday. It was fine. It was more than fine. I had learned, somewhere in those years, to tell the difference between a life that was going well and a life that was performing well. I had both. I was grateful for both. I was also grateful in a way that was new and hard to explain, for having given up the waiting. Wendell Avenue still existed. My parents were presumably still in it. I knew this in the abstract way you know things you've chosen not to investigate. Barbara occasionally mentioned them in passing. Gary's knee, Sandra's garden, a dinner they'd had with the Delacroix, and I registered these updates the way you register weather reports for cities you're not visiting. I had not driven down that street again. And then Aunt Barbara called on a Thursday afternoon in November, and I was in my car on Route 315 coming back from a property visit, and she said, "Claire, I need to tell you something before you hear it another way." The house at 22 Wendell was going on the market. Gary had had a stroke the previous spring. Mild, Barbara said, but the beginning of something. His left hand trembled now. He was using a cane. The stairs had become complicated. Sandra's memory, which had been slightly unreliable for several years in ways the family had agreed not to name directly, had passed some internal threshold they could no longer overlook. There had been an assessment in February, conversations afterward about what was realistic. The house needed a new roof. The boiler needed replacing. There were other things. The savings had been eroded by Gary's medical expenses and by the quiet accumulation of years. They could not sustain the house, and they knew it. They're listing with an agency on the east side, Barbara said. They decided 2 weeks ago. I was on Route 315 with the radio off and the heater running. The November sky was flat and gray. "I know that agency," I said. There was a pause. "Claire," Barbara said carefully. "I'm just thinking," I said. I thought for 3 days. I want to tell you what I was actually thinking during those 3 days, because I believe in being precise about motives, especially my own. I thought about the numbers. The house at 22 Wendell was a sound acquisition at the current market rate. The neighborhood had been appreciating for 5 years. The structure had good bones, and the repairs were estimable. This was true, and I knew it was true, and I was not lying to myself about it. I also thought about the fact that I wanted to be in the room. I want to be clear about that. There was a part of me Not the largest part, but a real and honest part that had been carrying the image of a specific moment for a very long time. The moment when my mother sat across a table and understood who had bought her house. Not for cruelty, or not only for cruelty, for the satisfaction of being impossible to overlook. For the one moment in which the story could not be rewritten, because I would be sitting there and the paperwork would be signed and there would be nothing to adjust. I had been overlooked and rewritten for 30 years. I wanted to be the ending. I'm not proud of that. I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't there. I called the listing agency on a Monday morning and told them I was interested in 22 Wendell and I'd be working with cash. The showing was on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. I drove down Wendell slowly. The white shutters, the garden, thinner than I remembered. The driveway crack running from the base of the front steps to the street in that patient diagonal. I sat in front of the house for 4 minutes. The same 4 minutes I'd given myself at 27, parked in front of number 14, feeling something I couldn't name. Then I went in. Kevin, the agent, was young and professional and managed to show me through each room without making anything about the fact that I was spending longer than a normal buyer spends. Sandra and Gary had been asked to leave the house during the showing, as is standard. I learned later from Barbara that they'd gone to the coffee shop on Elm Street and sat there for 2 hours, and Sandra had ordered a slice of lemon cake she didn't finish. I walked through the kitchen first. The tile was the same. The window above the sink was in the same position it had been in every morning of my childhood. There was a bowl of apples on the counter. The deliberate kind of bowl placed to make a space feel inhabited to someone who doesn't live there. I stood at that counter for a moment that stretched. Kevin said nothing. I walked through the living room. Gary's chair was gone, replaced by something smaller, different in angle, but the space where it had been was as familiar as furniture. I knew exactly where he had sat for 20 years with the television on. I walked through the bedrooms. My old room was a sewing room. The machine sat on a table under a cloth cover. There was a shelf of paperback novels I recognized by their spines. The same editions Sandra had owned since the 80s. The same novels, unreplaced. The spines faded in exactly the way of books that have been read many times and put back. On the windowsill, a small ceramic cardinal. I stood in that room for longer than made sense. "Take all the time you need," Kevin said from the doorway. I made the offer that afternoon. Full ask. Cash, 30-day close. The closing was scheduled for a Friday morning in December at the agency's main office on the east side of Columbus. I arrived first. Kevin met me in the lobby and brought me to a conference room with a table that seated 6 and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. He offered coffee. I sat on the far side of the table, my back to the window, and waited. Sandra and Gary arrived at 9:15. I heard them before I saw them. The careful pace of 2 people moving with attention, a cane on the tile floor, the low sound of Kevin greeting someone at the door. And then Gary came in first, moving slowly, his left hand close to the doorframe. Sandra followed, smaller than I had let myself imagine, her coat buttoned to the top, her bag held in both hands. They settled into the seats across from me without looking up. Kevin introduced us. "This is our buyer," Kevin said. "Cash offer, no contingencies." Gary looked up and said he was pleased to meet me in the measured, polite way of a man meeting a stranger in a professional context. Sandra raised her eyes and gave me the small, composed smile she had always used with people she didn't know, warm at the surface, nothing behind it she hadn't chosen to put there. 30 years. That was what 30 years looked like. Kevin went through the document stack. I signed where indicated. Sandra and Gary signed where indicated. The room had the quiet of paperwork, the particular stillness of a significant thing being made administrative. I watched them without watching them. Sandra's hands on the documents were the same hands I had looked at across kitchen tables for the first 19 years of my life. Small and precise, nails kept short, the pen held between two fingers rather than three, which I had copied without knowing it until a colleague pointed it out to me at 32. At one point, Gary looked up from a page and asked Kevin how much longer the process would take. Almost through, Kevin said. Gary nodded. He looked at the window. Then, to no one in particular, the way older people sometimes speak, not expecting an answer, just releasing something into the room, he said, "We lived in that house for 41 years. I said nothing." Sandra, without looking up from the document in front of her. It was a good house. A pause. We raised our daughter there. Another pause, quieter. One daughter. She left when she was young. Very determined girl. A pause that lasted longer than the others. We lost touch. She said it the way you say something you said so many times, you no longer hear yourself saying it. Not unkindly. Not performing. Just reported. Kevin slid the final page across to Sandra. She picked up her pen. I said, "The third step from the bottom makes a sound. It's been that way since before I could reach the banister." The pen stopped. I said, "The window above the kitchen sink faces east. In October, the light comes in at 7 in the morning and stays on the counter until 8. Sandra's hand was very still on the page. I said, "You were at the kitchen tap when the door closed. I could hear the water running." Sandra turned her head slowly and looked at me. I had watched her face for most of my childhood. I knew every version of it. The composed version, the exact version she used in difficult conversations, the particular stillness she deployed when she was most upset. I had not expected to see this version, which was none of those. This was something older and less managed, something that had been behind all the others for a very long time without light. The recognition moved through her the way something moves that has been underwater for years and has finally reached the surface. She said, "Claire," barely a sound. "Hi, Mom," I said. Gary made a sound that wasn't a word. Kevin was very still on his side of the table. The room held all of it. The 30 years, the 2 bags, the yellow shutters, the step that had always made that sound, and none of it was spoken, and all of it was present. And my mother looked at me across a conference table in Columbus, Ohio, and understood completely who had bought her house. We signed the papers. Kevin moved through the document stack efficiently, which I respected. Gary's signature was deliberate and slow, the pen held carefully against the tremor. Sandra's was exactly as I remembered it. Small, precise letters, the capital S looping back at the top, with a carefulness that was entirely her. The same signature she had used on 30 years of checks and documents and birthday cards I had not received. Some things don't change. Afterward, we were in the parking lot. I'm not certain how it happened. Someone suggested air, or we all simply moved in the same direction when Kevin said we were done. Gary sat in the passenger seat of their car with the door open and both feet on the pavement and his elbows on his knees. Sandra stood by the hood. I stood a few feet away, hands in my coat pockets. It was cold, gray sky. A car passed on the street. We were very still, not with the composed precision she used in other people's presence. With something underneath it, something old and unmanaged. She said, "I was wrong to do what I did." Not, "I had my reasons." Not, "You have to understand the circumstances." Not, "Things were different then, and you were difficult, and I was doing my best." Just, "I was wrong." 4 words. The plainest 4 words she had ever offered me. I sat with them for a moment. I said, "I know that too." Gary said from the car, in the halting way of a man forming a sentence that has been waiting for years to be said, "Claire, we don't—" He stopped. "We don't have a plan for where we're going." I looked at him. Old man with a trembling hand and a cane, and 30 years of not coming to my door. I said, "You can stay." He looked up. "The house is mine," I said. but you can stay for as long as you need." Sandra put her hand over her mouth. It was the first time in my memory that she made that gesture. The covering of the mouth against something arriving faster than she could manage. She was trying not to cry in a parking lot, which was something Sandra would fight very hard not to do, and she was losing. I drove home that afternoon, and I sat in my own house and looked at nothing for a while. I had wanted to see her face. I had imagined that moment in various forms for years. What I had imagined was not what it was. What it was something I did not have a name for. Not victory, not the completion of anything, not the satisfaction I'd expected. Something closer to standing in a doorway of a room you didn't know was there, finding it quiet and empty, and not knowing whether to go in or to stand and look. I went in. They moved back into the house on the 14th of January. I arranged the movers. I had the boiler replaced before they arrived, and the roof assessed, and a section of the kitchen floor relaid where it had been lifting near the back door. I had both sides of the staircase fitted with a railing because the existing one wasn't sufficient for Gary's mobility. I arranged for Rosa, a home health aide whose quiet competence I recognized in the first 15 minutes of our conversation, to come 3 days a week. I drove over on Sundays. The first visits were careful and practical. We talked about the heating, about what repairs were still pending, about how the aid system was working. We drank tea in the kitchen and addressed the immediate present, which was manageable, and left the 30 years of past in the past, which seemed, for the time being, to be where it was most comfortable for all of us. Sandra made the tea exactly as she always had. The bag left in precisely 4 minutes, no more. The cup passed across the table with a particular exactness that was not about tea. I understood, watching her, that this exactness was her way of being present in a room, her way of saying, without saying, "I am still here. I am still attending." By March, something had shifted. I had come over early one Sunday morning, some maintenance pretext I've since forgotten, and Gary was alone in the kitchen when I came through the door. Sandra was still sleeping. He looked up when I came in, and there was something on his face that had been working its way to the surface for months. He said, "I should have come to your door." I sat down across from him. "That night," he said, "when your mother said what she said, I should have gotten up and come to your doorway and told her to stop." He looked at his hands. The tremor was there, fine and constant. I kept thinking someone else would fix it. I kept waiting for the situation to resolve on its own, which is what I had always done, and it never resolved. And then you were gone. He paused. "I was afraid," he said. "Not afraid of her, not like that. I just spent so many years finding the path that avoided conflict that I couldn't see any other path. And I let that outweigh you." He looked at me. "That's not an excuse. I know that." "No," I said, "it's not." He nodded. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, a bird was active in the garden. I could hear it, but not see it through the window. Then he said, "You turned out remarkable, Claire." I said, "I know." He almost smiled. I almost did. Gary died on the 15th of September. The second stroke was more serious than the first. He was in the hospital for 9 days, and I drove to Columbus on most of them. I sat with him when Sandra needed to rest. I sat with them, both in the room, and we occupied the same space in a way that was not comfortable and was real. He died on a Tuesday morning at 6:48. Sandra held his left hand. I held his right. His hand was the same shape as mine, the broad palm, the blunted fingertips, and I had never noticed that before, had never had a reason to look at his hand directly for that long, and I spent some time after he died simply looking at our hands, side by side, and saying nothing. The funeral was on a Saturday. At the reception afterward, back at the house on Wendell, Mrs. Delacroix made her way to Sandra's side. I was across the room, near the kitchen doorway. I wasn't listening for anything particular. Mrs. Delacroix took Sandra's hand and said, "You must be so proud of Claire, everything she's built." Sandra looked up across the room and she found me. She said, "I am," said to the woman she had told for 30 years a different version of the story, in a room full of people who had known the different version, said in a voice that was not small and not qualified and not performing anything. I looked back at her. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sandra died on the 19th of April. Her memory had been declining since October, small at first, then less small. By February, she sometimes didn't know what day it was. By March, she sometimes didn't know where she was, though she always knew who was in the room with her, which Rosa told me was a meaningful distinction. By April, she was mostly somewhere else. Rosa called me that morning. Sandra had gone to bed peacefully the night before, had sat at the kitchen window watching the garden in the dark, had gone to her room without difficulty. She hadn't woken with everything intact. She died in the house on Wendell Avenue, in her room, in her bed, with the ceramic cardinal on the windowsill. I sat with her for a while before I called anyone back. The room was very quiet. The April light was coming in at the angle it comes in that time of year in Ohio. Gentle, uncommitted, nothing like summer. I thought about the bowl of apples on the counter at the showing. I thought about the white shutters where yellow ones had been. I thought about 4 words in a parking lot and 2 words across a room at a funeral. I thought about the 19-year-old who walked out that door with nothing in her hands. The house at 22 Wendell is mine now. I changed nothing about the kitchen. The ceramic cardinal is still on the windowsill in what used to be Sandra's room. I go back most weekends. The tea steeps for 4 minutes. The October light comes in through the east window at 7 in the morning and stays on the counter until 8. The third step from the bottom still makes a sound.